Hi, geometry students. It is day 4 of Unit 3, and we are going to be doing some mini proofs. So on the notes packet itself, you're going to notice that the little T-charts aren't given to you. So I took a second and I just drew in a couple on my own. And you can draw them in. I used a straight edge, or you can just freehand, either way. But what you want to remember is that left-hand column, this is always the statements. And then the right-hand column is always the reasons why you're allowed to say what you did. All right. So each of these is only going to be a couple of steps, hence why they're little mini proofs, but it gives us a chance to practice all the reasons on our reason sheet. So starting with the very first one, we have B is the midpoint of AC. And that is given. Now, something to keep in mind, you can put both the givens together. I like to split them up when there's a vocab word to focus on. So the fact that there's the word midpoint right here, I want to be able to say midpoint implies something. So that's what I'm going to make my step 2 right here. So go to the diagram. If B is the midpoint of segment AC, then that means these two little parts are going to be congruent. And that's because midpoint implies two congruent segments, right? And so I'm just going to highlight that to connect those two steps there. And now my two congruent segments are simply AB and BC. So over here, and now when I read it top to bottom at the moment, it says B is the midpoint of AC because they told us. Therefore, AB is congruent to BC because midpoint implies two congruent segments. So that should make sense. All right. For step 3, now I'm going to go grab my other given. So AB is congruent to CD because they told me. And so in the diagram, AB is congruent to CD over here. And so now step 4. All right, it doesn't quite look the way some of the other ones did, but it's the idea that if AB is congruent to BC and AB is also congruent to CD, I can kind of cut out the middleman of the AB part, and I can go right to saying that BC is congruent to CD. And my reason for that is the transitive property. And that's what we are looking to prove. And so we are done with our proof. So 4 steps, could have been 3, but that's the idea of what we are working on here. So when we move on to number 2, oh, my dog is having at it. Number 2, we've got an isosceles triangle, ABC with base BC. So it might be good to note that this is the base down here. All right. If I want to, I can just say S and R for statements and reasons. There's no problem if you guys want to abbreviate that. All right. We have 2 givens, notice, that have vocab words in them. So I've got isosceles, I've got bisects. So there's going to be a lot that we can say from those, which is kind of nice. Now, looking at isosceles, technically we can talk about either congruent sides or congruent angles. But look at what we're trying to prove. We're trying to prove that AB is congruent to CD in the end. So even though I can say multiple things from isosceles, I want to focus on the sides or on the segments in this case. So keep that in mind. All right, let's get going. So we've got isosceles triangle ABC, where the base is BC, and that's given. So like we said, let's focus on those sides. So if here's the base, here's my 2 congruent sides. So I want to be able to say that side AB is congruent to side AC. And now bring your vocab word down. You don't have to highlight every time, but if it helps, remind yourself that whatever vocab word is given here, I want to use it in that next step. So an isosceles triangle is going to imply that I have 2 congruent sides. All right. We've said what we needed to from that first given. Now let's move on to the second given. So for number 3, I'm going to say that BC bisects segment AD because it's given. All right, I've got a vocab term again. So bisects right here. That means I'm going to be saying that down here. But a bisector could be angle or it could be segment. So you got to read carefully. So when it says BC bisects segment AD, That's when I know what type of bisector I have. So for step 4, I have a segment bisector. And yes, you can abbreviate if you like. So segment bisector, that's going to imply that we have 2 congruent segments. And now in the diagram, you should be able to pick out what those 2 congruent segments are. So BC comes through and bisects AD. So you have to read that carefully. This is what's cutting it in half. This is the part that's actually getting bisected. So since AD is getting bisected, that means that AC here is congruent to CD. Those are my 2 congruent segments. All right. Last step. What are we trying to prove? We are trying to prove that AB over here is congruent to CD over here. And if I look at step 2, we know AB is the same as AC. Step 4, AC is the same as CD. AC is the middleman. We can cut that out and go right from AB is congruent to CD. And then the reason is that's the transitive property. This is congruent to this. That guy is congruent to that. So those 2 must be congruent. And then if it helps, you can always say which 2 steps if they're not immediately connecting. So we could say like step 2 and 4, right? If it was a quiz, would you lose credit for not saying that? No, but sometimes it's helpful when reading the proof to be like, wait, which 2 steps were transitive property? Those 2. Okay. All right, let's do the next guy here. We've got statements, reasons. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. That's the only given that we've got here. And if you notice, there's no vocab word. They're just telling you they're congruent. So go ahead and mark it in the picture. 1 is congruent to 2. So if there's no vocab term, there's no step that follows that from step 1, and there's nothing else given. So if there's nothing else given, you have to look at the picture and think, is there something that we could say from the diagram itself? There's one particular reason at this point that we know we can say without being given, and that's vertical angles. So right here in the picture, when we have those 2 lines that cross, we have a pair of vertical angles. So angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. And our reason is that vertical angles implies that we have 2 congruent angles. And you can write the word angle or write the symbol. All right, if you look at what you're trying to prove, we're trying to get 1 the same as 3 over here. And so we know 1's congruent to 2, 2 is congruent to 3. That's a perfect example of the transitive property. All right, it's a 3-stepper, but you still got to think on one like that just because of the fact that you only have that 1 given to go on. All right, I'm thinking let's maybe do 1 more and then we'll save some for class. So when we flip on over to that next page, let's do, let's see, maybe number 5 together. All right, so number 5. I haven't set up my little columns yet, so let me do that here. And of course, you don't have to use a straight edge. It just looks nicer when you do. All right, so we've got statements on the left side, reasons on the right, or just S and R if you want to abbreviate. Okay, we start always with our given. So AB is perpendicular to CD. If that symbol does not immediately tell you what's going on, right, then you have to make sure, right, that you write the word down so that you can focus on it. So from here, perpendicular is given. Okay, on our reason sheet, we kind of mentioned that perpendicular is usually a 2-stepper. So that's your vocab right here. That little symbol is our vocab. Carry that right down here. So perpendicular is going to imply that we have right angles. So in the diagram, we can mark the perpendicular right there. And so that tells us what the right angles are. So because here they're using the letters, let's use the letters versus putting in the numbers like 1 and 2. So I'm going to say that angle CBA and angle DBA are right angles. So make sure you read it and it makes sense. that angle CBA and DBA are right angles because perpendicular implies that we should have right angles. There we go. All right. Now when we hit this next step, we've got vocab again. We've got right angles here. Maybe I'll grab a different color just so that I don't confuse anybody. Got some colored pencils sitting next to me. So my right angles here, right, is my vocab word now. That's what's going to come down here. So the fact that I have right angles means if they're both right, they have to be congruent to each other. So that's going to give me two congruent angles. And now we can say that angle CBA is congruent to angle DBA. And that's my proof step. I'm done. All right. Let's save number 4 and number 6 for class tomorrow. So that's going to be our recap here. And then also up here. All right, go answer that post video question. Thanks, guys.